Eighth grade. As you can see, rocking a fresh cut here. Not saying how I got a haircut because I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but I got a haircut and I think it looks good. So, with that in mind, I think I'm going to tell some haircut jokes. One of the things I hope you guys learn from me is that you can be funny about any topic. So, when you go to high school next year and you're in a situation where you need to be funny, you need to think of a joke off the top of your head or something like that, just think to yourself, what would Mr. Bruce say in this situation? And then you'll probably say something funny and everyone will laugh and it'll be awesome. All right. Haircut jokes. How did the barber cut the son's hair? Eclipse it. S-U-N, son. Oh man, that one's good. Yeah, I got this haircut today, and I really didn't like it at first, but it's growing on me. Where do the sheep go to get their haircut? To the barber shop. All right, three simple haircut jokes. Jokes for any occasion. That's what I'm all about. Okay. Um, Today's lesson is going to be on the Compromise of 1850. So, last time I talked about the debate over slavery between people like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay and the abolitionists, and how Henry Clay basically made a bunch of proposals that the abolitionists rejected and people like John C. Calhoun, who were pro slavery, rejected. Um, but because of the death of President Zachary Taylor, um, President Millard Fillmore took his place and was able to sign the bill into law. So even though the Compromise of 1850 was very unpopular, it was signed into law. So what was the Compromise of 1850? Well, the Compromise of 1850 was basically a collection of compromises that Henry Clay had proposed we make to deal with the issue of what do we do with all the land from the Mexican Cession. So remember, land from the Mexican Cession does not fall under the laws governing the Missouri Compromise, right? The Wilmot Proviso didn't pass, so that's not a law. Missouri Compromise does not apply to California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, because they are not part of the Louisiana Purchase. They are part of the Mexican Cession. Right? And all this comes to a head in 1849, 1850, because California is going to be admitted to the nation as a free state. So this presents the same problem that Missouri presented with the Missouri Compromise. It's going to disrupt the balance of power between slave states and free states. So rather than making another compromise like the Compromise of 1850, Congress adopts for the Compromise of 1850, Congress adopts the suggestions made by Henry Clay. So what are these suggestions? All right, this is slide 8. So there are things that benefit the North and they benefit the South. So we'll start off with what helps out the North. Number 1, California gets admitted to the United States as a free state. All right. Number 2, Washington, D.C. Is not allowed to buy or sell any slaves at all. So if you live in Washington, D.C., you can own a slave, but you cannot buy or sell a slave, right? So basically what this does is it says, all right, Washington, D.C., you can have slavery for like one generation, and then basically when the slaves die, when they get old and die, you can't buy or sell any slaves. You're not going to be able to have any more slaves, so slavery is going to expire in Washington, D.C. So it's not an outright ban on slavery in Washington, D.C., but it is basically making it impossible for slavery to continue in Washington, D.C. Right, so that helps out the North. What helps out the South? So Congress says the federal government does not have the power to regulate the slave trade in interstate commerce. So this is a big deal because it means Congress is saying we do not have the power to control trade in between the states. Right? So we can say that Washington, D.C. cannot buy or sell slaves inside of Washington, D.C., but there's nothing we can do to stop Mississippi and Alabama from exchanging slaves with each other. Right? If you're a slave trader and you want to sell slaves in Mississippi and Alabama, you can do that. Right? So interstate commerce is a really big deal because it allows slave traders to become wealthy. It also incentivizes slaveholders to have their female slaves get pregnant and have more slaves, slave babies that you can sell across state lines. So basically, Congress stepping back and saying we can't control the slave trade between the states is basically Congress saying, yeah, we're not going to mess with slavery in the South. Right? So this is a really big deal for the South. Popular sovereignty is another thing that helps out the South. Right? So this means that Congress is saying we are not going to make any laws that outlaw slavery in the southern states, and we're not going to make any laws that outlaw slavery in any of the Mexican cession states except for California. So California is the only state from the Mexican cession that is not allowed to have slaves. So Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, these future states are going to be able to vote on whether or not they can have slavery, right? And this is true for all of the remaining territories that are going to become states, regardless of their geography. North or South, doesn't matter. When they're being admitted into the Union, the people of those states get to decide for themselves if they're going to have slavery or not. Right? That's what popular sovereignty means. So this helps out the South because it basically gives them what they want. Federal government is not going to make any laws outlawing slavery, except California, illegal in California. The biggest issue, however, in the Compromise of 1850 was something called the Fugitive Slave Law. So the Fugitive Slave Law was a really, really big deal. And this helped out the South a lot, and it made the North furious. Right? So what did the Fugitive Slave Law say? It's also called the Fugitive Slave Act. Remember, acts and laws are the same thing. Right? This was the main reason the North opposed the Compromise of 1850. So what did it do? It allowed government officials to arrest any person accused of being a runaway slave. So if you were accused by anyone of being a runaway slave, the government had the power to arrest you. Number 2, it said, if you are accused of being a runaway slave, you do not have a right to a trial. Right? You don't get to have a trial to decide if you are a slave or free. Number 3, it says that when you are arrested for being accused of being a runaway slave, not only do you not get a trial, but you have to prove that you are not a runaway slave. Right? So you have to have a way to prove that you were never a slave. You never ran away, even if it was like 20 years ago. Right? You have to prove that you were never a slave. Number 4, it said, if any white person swears that you are a runaway slave, no matter what, you're guilty. Right? All it takes is one white person to swear that you are a runaway slave, and if he does, you're guilty. And number 5, it said Northerners have to help government officials catch runaway slaves if the government official requests it. So if I'm in New York and I'm an abolitionist and I think slavery is really bad, and my neighbor is a black person who is accused of being a runaway slave, I have to help the police arrest my black neighbor if they ask me to, right? Even if I know he's not a runaway slave. If the police ask me to help arrest a black person, I have to do it. So this is a really, really big deal, right? And Northerners felt this was evil. This was an incredible abuse of states' rights because it allowed the federal government in the southern states to interfere with freedom in the northern states. So the Fugitive Slave Act is a really big deal. And under the Fugitive Slave Act, a lot of really bad stuff happened. So, for example, there was a man who lived with his wife and 2 children. He was a black guy, and he was accused of being a runaway slave. He was arrested. He was not given a trial. A white person said, yeah, that guy's a runaway slave. And he was sent to the South, and he never saw his family again. Right? He was just like a regular dad. And he got pulled away from his family and sent to the South, and he was gone forever. There was a really famous case of a black tailor who was arrested and accused of being a runaway slave. He was innocent, but because a white person swore that he was a runaway slave, it didn't matter. So there were a lot of riots that happened in the North because federal troops, U.S. Army soldiers, were going into northern neighborhoods and basically forcing people to help them arrest black people, right? And of course, what would Southern slave owners do? Well, all they had to do was go to the North and they would find a black person, and then they would pay a white person to lie and say that black person is an escaped slave. So you could just see a random black person on the street, and you have a white person with you, and you say, hey, I'll pay you $100 if you help me catch that black guy, and you swear in front of a government official that he is an escaped slave. Right? So this happened a lot. A lot of people who never were slaves in their life, who were born and raised in the North, were captured and forced into slavery in the South. Really, really big deal. So Northerners are outraged. Many vowed not to follow the law. There were abuses of the law, lying witnesses. So what ended up happening is a lot of black people who lived in the North were so afraid of this law that they moved to Canada. They fled away to Canada. They left their jobs. Some of them were split up from their families. They left their homes. Some who were captured, of course, were permanently torn away from their families and sent to the South, somewhere they'd never been before. So northern cities did a lot to try to resist the Fugitive Slave Act. And it made the North hate slavery more than ever. And it made tensions between the North and the South more intense than ever. Okay. In the next video, we'll talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that will probably be what we cover in the next video.